what can I see that I haven't seen before? That's a different perspective on our lives, because our lives aren't just lessons. Our lives are not just reducible to white racism or limited imagination, but our lives aren't as complex as other people. Our lives are creative. Our lives hold magic and beauty and vastness and multitudes.
Hi friends, I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of personal pain and social division. Okay, you are in for quite a conversation today. You get to hear me nerd out with Danté Stewart about literature and theology and Black Jesus. But before I get into that conversation, I want to make two announcements. One, I just want to remind you that the season of Advent is coming up if you are listening to this podcast on the day or close to the day when it's released. And I do have an Advent devotional, and I've got questions to go along with it, and it is available on Amazon. It's called Prepare Him Room. Just wanted to let you know about that in case you'd like a daily way to just get in touch with the spiritual side of preparing for Christmas. I also wanted to let you know that we are hosting a giveaway for my guest, Danté Stewart's new book, Shoutin in the Fire. If you're interested, check the show notes or head on over to my Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook pages to find out details on how to participate in that giveaway. Now, on to the main event, which is this conversation. It was an incredible conversation about love, about expanding our theological imagination, about understanding more about what it means to love God, to love who and how God has made us, and how to love our neighbors. So here you go. Well, I am so grateful to be here with my guest, Danté Stewart. And Danté, just want to start by thanking you for joining us today in the midst of, I think you're in the midst of getting a degree from seminary. Is that right? You've just written a book. And not only that, but there is a small child in the room with you as you are talking to us. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, and not only that, I'm in ministry, so I'm literally
oh my gosh, right after
I list this. Nah, you good. I ain't tripping off that, but I'm saying just like, yeah, life is full.
A
lot. But it's a good full. I'm living a dream. I'm doing what I want to do, and my schedule is flexible, and I get time to read, I get time to work out, I get time to be with my family, I get time to enjoy life. So I'm really good.
Well, I love it. And I love that we get to talk here today. I just finished reading your new book. It's called Shoutin in the Fire, an American Epistle. It came out a couple of weeks ago, and I'm thinking that there probably are listeners who have not read your book because it just came out. So I wanted to start with your story, and I'd love for you to talk us through your story of faith in particular, which is one significant piece of this book. And I'd love to go back to what Christianity was like for you as a child and then as a college student and kind of those early years in college and right out of college. So could you tell us about that for a little while?
Yeah, 100%. And thank you for having me on, and thank you for your cohort of listeners and those who are invested in your space. We hope that you feel seen and inspired and things like that. So I was raised in rural South Carolina. I am the son of Deborah and Calvin Stewart, and I'm the youngest of four. So we, in my book, my faith life, especially as a young kid, centers around two places, the white stained brick church and my grandmother's red brick house. And I made sure that I narratively and literarily that I did that kind of in inspiration of Sarah Broom's book, The Yellow House, how she wrote so beautifully about her home and the world inside of her home and inside of rooms, but also the larger world inside of New Orleans that in some sense existed alongside the smaller world, which is her own family and community. And so my world exists between the red brick house and the white stained brick church, and between those places so much of life happened, both the great and the terrible dimensions of life. And when I think about my own home, I was raised Pentecostal, so much of the freedom of life, the freedom of the body, the freedom of the spirit that many people talk about, and even in this moment aspire to. I think we can say that at least in American public religion, that so many people are transitioning into more kind of less kind of institutional base things. I mean, in the sense of the kind of experience of people want experiences not tied to whether your experience is valuable to the institution. I think that's one of the things that was so in shaping by my Pentecostal church is that this is our experience. And as James Baldwin tells his nephew in his essay, letter to my nephew at the beginning of Fire Next Time, My Dungeon Shook, he says that famous quote, that people quote from James Baldwin, where they say, know from whence you came, and if you know from whence you came, you can know where you're going.
Yeah.
But the context of that quote is James Baldwin talking about the interiorness of Black life. What Elizabeth Alexander, the poet, calls the Black interior. It is the space away from the white logic. It's the space away from whiteness. It's where we create and make worlds. It's what Baldwin talks about, the beauty, that Black people indeed are beauty at the back end of the Fire Next Time. And so when I think about my Pentecostal space, I think about the interiorness of Black life beyond, the public, beyond ideas of Black people dying and the response to it, or the kind of justification of it. It is a space where young people can play instruments and be free and shout and dance, and older people can, guide young people. And even though, many of the dynamics, particularly the power dynamics, I don't agree with, and saw that they did incredible harm, I can also say that space, my faith life was beautiful, that it taught me a lot, that even though right now I am not Pentecostal by denomination or affiliation, I am Pentecostal by orientation.
Yeah.
So much of my life is still shaped by this kind of Pentecostal imagination of the faith, as it relates to allowing the Spirit to speak from our bodies, to say that our bodies have something to say that the places that we come from, as in Acts chapter 2, that these places must be named, because they have a certain type of knowledge production that can be beneficial for our faith life. And so wherever we come from, I think that those places have something to say about faith and embodiment and Christianity and life and liberation and wholeness. And so, yeah, I think about my early life of faith that way. And that's kind of the beginning of the ways I would kind of think about the story. Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that. That's a beautiful picture. And I love the connection in terms of the interior life, both as a inside your own body, but also within the white brick church, right? Like there are two ways in which you've got an interior space there, where there's an interior beauty and an interior life with God that might not be known in the public sphere. And so what I want to hear about next is then you went to college and that changed. And could you narrate that piece of your journey for a little bit, again, for listeners who haven't read your book?
Yeah. So I went to Clemson University in Clemson, South Carolina, where I played football, and I was a sociology student. And it's reminiscent of M. Sean Copeland. She writes a book entitled "Knowing Christ Crucified." In chapter 2, she titles chapter 2 "Meeting and Seeing Jesus in Slave-Holding Worlds." And of course, Clemson, is I mean, slavery is outlawed hundreds of years, in some sense.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about Clemson, thinking both about M. Sean Copeland and Sadia Hartman, where Sadia Hartman says, I too live in a time of slavery. And what I mean is that I live in a world created by it, and the future created by it. So when I think about meeting Jesus and seeing Jesus, as M. Sean Copeland wrote about Black folk back then in slaveholding worlds, it is about meeting, in some sense, like meeting this kind of idea of faith bound to white conceptions of Christianity. And oftentimes that meeting is not a meeting where we come alive and we feel seen and we feel loved and embraced. But oftentimes when we go into these white spaces, especially on Clemson University, particularly predominantly white institutions, we meet a Jesus or faith that oftentimes renders us invisible or erases us.
Mm-hmm.
or if they do see us, they see us as less than. So I talk about my time at Clemson, where none of the preachers in these spaces, particularly FCA, looked like me. They didn't look familiar like home. So we have to think of, and this is kind of me leaning on my sociological background. We have to think about, as I love the way C. Wright Mills puts it in his incredible book, Sociological Imagination, where he talks about this kind of the relationship between biography and history, or our own individual stories in the social world we live in,
Sure.
and what we inherit, or what, in some sense, we inherit, what type of scripts are bound to these institutions, what type of stories are bound to these institutions. So if people find it hard to think about that, Jesus, in the way that Jesus moved about in the religious and social and political spaces, Jesus, in some sense, oftentimes talks about the histories that are bound to these institutions. So the traditions, the theologies, every institution has practices, values, traditions bound into it. And we need to take into account who are those theologies and traditions built for, and who, in some sense, do they take seriously. So who are they built for, and who do they take seriously? So Jesus, in some sense, says, you have heard it said, blah, 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 but I say to you, blah, 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 blah. Jesus is not destroying the tradition and the theology in this sense, but he is saying, that your tradition may be public, but it can also be problematic. You may think your tradition is a tradition of renewal, in some sense, of what was in the past, when in actuality your tradition is negligent and must be rethought about what's going on in the present. And so when I went to Clemson and got involved in predominantly white spaces, the script that I inherited from these spaces was that wherever you came from, particularly if you're Black, then whiteness is right and Blackness is invisible. Whiteness is the norm. It is the unspoken norm. So many people in these spaces would not say, we're a white church, but in some sense, when you think about who is making the decisions, who is the people that this institution feels it cannot function without. If we think about a Lucille Clifton poem, won't you come celebrate with me with the type of life I've lived? If we think about who is on the end of that celebration, who will be those people celebrating with you, then that will determine and help you see who those people you built your institution for. And oftentimes in these predominantly white institutions, those who were celebrated in the end, if indeed we was a part of that celebration, it was only because we lost ourselves in the process. We got caught up inside of this kind of white hegemonic world, where at the end of the day, as Eddie Gillard talks about in his book, Democracy in Black, he talks about the value gap, where at the end of the day, people think that racism and white supremacy is about people in hoods and things like that. But it's more so about what and whom we as a country, and I would even add churches, choose to value. So what and whom we choose to value. And the value gap, he explains, is that this country values white lives, white pain, white culture, white tradition, white theologies, white whatever, more than any other place. And so when I went into these places, I, in some sense, was not a hero. I wasn't somebody going in trying, to change it, but I was someone who gave it justification. I was someone who was rewarded by it and enjoyed the rewards that it gave me. And that, in some sense, was probably part of that experience. So when I went into these spaces, the worship songs, the preaching, the feel of the place. So if we think in terms of aesthetics, feel of the place, the way it looks, the way people embody their faith, it just didn't take seriously where I came from, or the world, particularly the Black world that I came from, or the Black faith tradition that made me. And so to move from rural South Carolina into Clemson, white dominated place, was in some sense me taking on this story that you must distance yourself as much as possible from Blackness. And that in some sense, before you're ever Black, you're Christian. And that's what makes you valuable in this place. The identity that is most valued in this place is Christian. It's just too
Mm.
bad that those who made that test, particularly that litmus test, never took to account that the value scale was always tipped and set by whiteness.
Yeah, so there was a again, that goes back to the erasure and the invisibility, because it was essentially what matters most is that you're a Christian, although there was like this parenthetical white in front of the word Christian, right? Like, we're not going to say
Yes.
what it means to be Christian is also to be white in the sense of all that you just described in terms of cultural trappings. It's the same thing as the missionaries in countries where it's like you need to be wearing a dress in order to become a Christian. And
Indeed.
it's like, no, that has nothing to do with becoming a Christian. That has to do
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
this culture, and that does not have to do with introducing someone to Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, that's kind of why I got exhausted with, and even to this day, why I'm still exhausted with conversations about race and culture with white Christians or white people in general, who don't already have a working knowledge of the world that we live in and the world that we inherit. Because in some sense, it's like many people will continue to ask the same question. Well, what is white? What's
Mm,
whiteness?
right.
And it's like, yo, there has been centuries and decades of literature that talks about race, racism, whiteness, its relationship to society. I'm literally looking at a book right now entitled "Race, Class, and Gender in the United States," and then there's a book back here, like literally where my index finger is,
Yeah.
called the white one is entitled "The History of White People" by Neil Irvin Painter,
Yeah, I've got
and
that one too.
then above it is by Professor Valerie Babb, called "Whiteness Visible," and she's talking about arts and culture, and that's kind of in some sense it's like can we talk about if indeed people want to talk about race and culture and racism and white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, can people have better conversations where they already in some sense have some sort of working knowledge when they come to the table, rather than simply trying to figure out, okay, what is whiteness and things like that. Well when you live and move and have your being, like, that is what whiteness is in our
Hmm.
society. What people are protected from, who is centered, who gets hurt, and how, and the degree who gets hurt, whose pain gets to be valued. And
Mm.
then when you ask all those questions, as many questions as you can, you know of our society. And as my professor, Dr. Fluker, always says, he says the first ethical question is, as Marvin Gaye says, what's going on? That's the first ethical question. What's going on? So you're trying to figure out and uncover what actually is. What is the
Mm.
reality of what's going on? And once you ask those type of questions, then you do social and cultural analysis and ask who, in some sense, is at the center of the what is going on. And
Mm.
once you kind of get the social markers of the who, then that would tell you pretty much many of the questions about who is valued, what whiteness is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, I just think that I think people need to just do better reading and things like that, so that the same conversations that people have been having 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago are not the same type of conversations that that people are trying to have right now, especially those conversations that still, even if somebody talk about race and racism, it still ways that people make black people invisible, especially when they talk about racism and race and things like that, and in a perspective that white people still are centered in their education and progress. So it's like, what can I learn? What can I do? What can I do? What can I do? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in reality, many of the questions is, what can I see that I haven't seen before?
Mm.
That's a different perspective on our lives, because our lives aren't just lessons. Our lives are not just reducible to white racism or limited imagination. But our lives are as complex as other people. Our lives are creative. Our lives hold magic and beauty and vastness and multitudes. And I think, as I'm surrounded by so many just Black books about a multitude of perspectives on Black life, I want to lean into that. How can I explore, the vastness and the beauty of our lives so that we don't just reduce ourselves to, somebody else's gospel in a sense.
Well, and I think the vastness of that beauty is something that comes up in your book. And I think it's so interesting that so much of that has come to you, well, it seems by way of literature, theology, but written particularly by Black people, which I want to get back to. But before we do that, as we're talking about whiteness, I also want to talk about Black Jesus. And I think you know this. The way I found your book was because I read your essay in the New York Times about a month ago. And you put into words something that I have been trying to formulate for a long time. So I'm going to quote you. So this is an essay that was adapted from your book, and you're writing about some Black authors who we'll talk about in a minute. But and here's what you say. You say, they insisted on saying Jesus is Black. They were not talking about his skin color during his earthly ministry, though it definitely wasn't white. They were talking about his experience, about how Jesus knows what it means to live in an occupied territory, knows what it means to be from an oppressed people. And that was just really helpful for me in terms of articulating what it means to talk about Black Jesus. I think I, for a long time, had been like, yes, definitely Jesus was not white and like Western European in how he looked. And also, I think for every culture to imagine Jesus in their cultural forms, whether that's clothing or appearance or whatever, there's an appropriateness to that in the sense that the incarnate God can come among us in all sorts of forms. But you bring another perspective to it, which is that Jesus's experience actually is that of someone who lived in an occupied territory and knows what it means to be from an oppressed people. And so I'd love to just talk about Black Jesus for a minute. Did you grow up talking about Black Jesus? Like, was that part of your vocabulary as a kid?
Yeah, not even as a kid. I think it came by way of me reading James Cone and Katie Cannon. So Black liberation theologians and womanist theologians, that kind of lingo, if we're thinking about that kind of linguistic framework, but the kind of existential framework, this idea of Jesus not being white, but standing in solidarity with Black folk, was very much a part of the ethos of my upbringing. Even though people wouldn't necessarily, articulate Jesus as, in some sense, being Black in the kind of experiential form, the people on the affirmative would view Jesus as a friend, Jesus as a liberator, Jesus as a suffer with, Jesus as one who resists, Jesus who represent an alternative epistemology from the white Christian conception of Jesus that so often kind of choked out, our lives and snuffed out our lives. So from a kid, I was in this ethos of what would a life look like walking with Black Jesus. When I got older and then when I left the white church and transitioned seminaries and changed my reading and things like that, then I got to the point where I wasn't just understanding what would it look like to have a life lived with a Jesus who was Black, but then I was able to articulate what does it mean to look at a Jesus and talk about a Jesus who was Black. And I'm not a novice in this. Let me be very clear. I'm not, like, there's nothing new, novel about the ways that I'm talking. What I'm simply doing is leaning on the voices of Katie Cannon and James Cone and other womanists and feminists and Black liberation, Black male theologians who have articulated this idea of Jesus as arising from our kind of experiential narrative, our experiential norm, as a critical alternative to the ways in which white religion has been practiced in the country. There's a really good book I think everybody should read. It's entitled Voices from the margin, interpreting the
Mhm.
Bible in the third, and I think it's entitled "Interpreting the Bible in the Third World," if I'm not mistaken. It
Yeah.
is one of the best, I thought, most helpful, as
Yeah.
well as Deeper Shades of Purple,
Oh, I don't know that one.
which goes. Oh, it's a brilliant. I mean, Deeper Shades of Purple is just one of my absolutely favorite books. It's on
Hmm.
womanist interpretation. Um, so it's womanism and in religion and society. So they had a cohort of speakers, writers, and biblical scholars and interpreters, um, talking about womanist theology and kind of larger practice. They had people respond to it. Then Voices from the Margin is got a cohort of biblical scholars from all over the globe to do biblical and theological work from their own narrative.
Mm.
And so as I got older, I started to read James Cone and Katie Cannon and Renita Weems, and M. Sean Copeland and others. Then I started to get a framework of understanding my faith beyond the logics of the ways in which white Americans believed that their interpretation was the interpretation of the Bible,
Right.
where white traditions of understanding Jesus and God and the Bible and faith, had now become orthodoxy. And I believe at a point in time in my life, I had believed that. I had
Right.
gave that power. I embodied that. I know that tradition very well because I was trained in it. I understood that tradition. I understand the frameworks of that tradition. And so often, we take for granted that every tradition is always contextual, and authority, whether people believe it to be objective or not. The reality is that authority is always given from the community that gives it. And so when you're thinking about a larger history, creeds and doctrines only have authority because those communities gave those kind of narratives authority.
Right.
And then that authority, either for good or for ill, exercise itself in the world because it believed that God granted it authority, whether that was true or not. It just is what it is. And so what I think about Black Jesus, it's being able to say that Black women and men have authority to talk about faith and Christianity and the frameworks in which we think about our faith and the practice of it. And that is the very fundamental experience of Black Jesus. Whether you're talking about James Cone and him writing God of the Oppressed, or you're talking about Katie Cannon and her writing Black Womanist Ethics, or you're talking about Emily Towns and her writing Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil, or you're talking about M. Sean Copeland and the Flesh and Freedom. You have all these long traditions of black and black theologians, or black and woman theologians doing interpretive, imaginative, and intersectional work. Because in some sense, that's where we exist at when we come to the Bible. We inherit the Bible, we interpret the Bible. We should be imaginative in our work, but we also should be innovative. Leaning on Kiese Layman as he talks about what he teaches his students with the essay. And that's kind of what they did with the Bible and theology. And so leaning into that tradition, that's how I came to understand Jesus' experience of Blackness and the ways in which my understanding of my faith should broaden, given, given taking seriously the knowledge that came from Black people that made me.
Well, that's what I was about to say. It's like Jesus's experience of Blackness, but also the Black experience of Jesus. For me as a white Christian, that one of the things that I felt clarified from your essay was I need to know Black Jesus. Like, that's really important. And I think it put words to something I've been knowing or thinking about for a very long time. But I think about even the relationship when you're talking about those interior spaces. I'm thinking about churches where from the pulpit, if you're hearing a preacher, obviously, often in a predominantly white church, you're going to have a white preacher. But even then, are you hearing white theologians and white illustrations even of white life, right? Or is there this broader understanding of what it means to embody in the church library, who are the names on the shelves, right? Like, I mean, you've named lots of different people white people who think they're very theologically, fully read, might be like, I've never heard of those people, right? And so there's just there's an expansion and a corrective that can be offered that way, and I think that's obviously really important as a Black Christian, but also for white Christians to understand. It's hard to understand the narrowness until we start to ask some of the questions that you're bringing up about what's going on and who is it going on with and for, right? And how can I start to ask and what was going on when Jesus was walking this earth, and what was going on in Acts when the Spirit was coming and actually translating the word of God to many languages and many ethnic groups, and had this vision of a global community of people who follow Jesus. So anyway, I'm thankful to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, and I one of the things, and that's actually what made me fall in love with theology and the Bible once again. Because I feel like if we're honest, I think if we're honest, this is not for everybody, but I do think at some point we do get tired of God and the Bible and Jesus, and just and in some sense how, if we're being honest, if we're going to be straight, if we're going to shoot it straight, there are often times where many people get tired with God and the Bible and Jesus, because it's almost as if God, the Bible, and Jesus is locked into a past that we can never reach, that we can never attain, that we always must be in search for. So when the Bible speaks of God being as near in this metaphorical language, as our breath, God is speaking. And if we thinking about the historical trajectory of the sacred text between the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures, and people being able to have conversation with God continually, at some point we get tired of faith and the Bible and God, because at some point when your faith, your God, and your Bible is locked into the past, then at some point it's going to become irrelevant to the present, and it will have nothing to offer you in the future.
Amen. I'm just thinking about the role of the Spirit in that, right? And I'm thinking even about your Pentecostal roots, and just that sense of, even just referencing back to like the day of Pentecost, and that idea of, if we are not in ongoing communal, not just individual, but like relationship with the Spirit, and using our spiritual imaginations, not just to understand the past, but to envision who and what God is for this moment and these people and this culture, and all of these places, then it becomes dead religion instead of something that is living and
it's boring. It becomes boring. It becomes boring in some sense, and I think, and in some sense, when I was in Reformed and Southern Baptist spaces, it was boring to me, because religion was a code word, was in some sense, was another word for indoctrination. I got tired of the curriculum in those spaces, because the curriculum were always white, dead men, dead or alive.
Well, and there was a right answer, right?
100%. Yeah, there was always an answer to everything.
That was my sense, because I similarly had a evangelical, and I'm grateful for many aspects of that, but I did feel like there's a right answer here, as opposed to a sense of humility before the mystery of an ongoing lived experience with Jesus. So I want to make sure that I get to ask you about Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, because that was the other part of your essay that I was like, oh my gosh. Because I was an English major in college with an African-American studies minor. And so
where'd you go to school?
I went to Princeton. So I was in.
Oh, you went to Princeton. Who did you take? Who did you take? I don't know if your listeners ever heard.
I know. I don't share.
Heard this? Okay, hold on. All right. We're gonna flip the script real quick. I'm gonna become the
So,
interviewer real quick.
okay,
Who did you
I don't
say?
usually tell people this because it seems kind of like I'm bragging, but like
No,
nail
no, no. But tell
painter.
me more.
All right.
Yeah. Tell me more.
So Nell Painter was one of my teachers. I took History of the South with her.
Oh
And
wow.
Toni Morrison was one of my teachers too. So
What?
I
Okay. Whoa,
know.
whoa. Hold on. All right. All right. We talk about my book. All right. Come on. All right. But let's put that on pause. Let's talk about that real quick.
Okay.
Tell me, describe. As Toni was very clear. Toni was very like adamant about you describing the feeling. So
I
describe the
mean, I
world of the
was,
classroom.
yeah, so I was in awe of her without a doubt. Like I was definitely so she wrote a book called Playing in the Dark,
Oh
which
yeah,
is a
whiteness in the
series.
literary imagination.
Yeah. So this class was a essentially that book in class form. So we read a lot of like classic quote unquote American literature. So we read Uncle Tom's Cabin and Moby Dick and Huck Finn. I wrote a 30-page paper on Huck Finn in that class.
Oh goodness, I need to read
So
that.
we read Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and she was talking about the presence of black characters with or blackness. Not in Moby Dick, it's
Yes.
even more just the idea of white and black, like of whiteness and blackness, and how it shapes and forms that literature, and sometimes destroys it. Actually, like that makes it because of the unwillingness to reckon with what's going on. I mean, I think part of why Huck Finn in the end is this kind of what just happened here. I think that's part of it is just an inability to actually come to a place of understanding
Mm.
because we as a country, we have not figured out what it means, right, to experience our full humanity as black and white people, as we are called and have called, created ourselves to be, or whatever we want to call it. Anyway, so yeah, it was amazing. I did not, I mean, I only talked to her in person twice, like once at a party for the African American Studies department,
Yeah.
where I just thanked her for the influence she'd had on my life because I had read Beloved in high school, and it really did put me on this trajectory of just like similar to you, I think, like soaking in these writers and being like, oh my gosh, the richness of this tradition of specifically the literature, going back to whether it's Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs narratives through to Toni Morrison and others today. That richness was just really compelling to me, and I guess different to me than what I was reading in. I mean, I appreciate white American literature too, but that was where
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
really, and I think part of it had to do with faith though. As a
Yeah. One hundred
Christian,
percent.
like I really resonated with the experience of faith that was often, it wasn't, it was very complex and mysterious. So like Zora Neale Hurston, like their eyes were watching God. Like, wait, they were watching God? God wasn't watching. What was going on there? Like, it just prompts all these questions. So, anyway, all right. So I get to take back the interview now.
That's cool. I mean, because Toni sits right over my shoulder. I mean,
I,
yeah, Toni sits over my. So I mean, she's on my desk. I mean, literally, Toni's everywhere in my office.
well, yeah, but will you talk about that because people, it is only, I'm only just starting to read, and maybe this is because I'm missing out, but I'm only just starting to read people who are actually writing about the way her faith was an aspect of her literature. And I would love to hear you speak to that because I feel as though she was put in this category of serious literary writer, and so it's almost like, and so we don't get to talk about her as a person of faith, but I would love to just hear you talk about that a little bit.
Well, my studies is particularly focused on James Baldwin, so I can only speak to Toni Morrison insofar as I speak to Toni Moore. I can only speak to Toni Morrison as an admirer.
Yeah.
I can speak to a little bit. I can speak to Baldwin a little bit better with a certain sense of
Well, and I'd
authority.
love for you to do that too. I actually,
Um,
so he was,
yeah, yeah,
my senior
yeah,
thesis was one
yeah.
chapter was on Baldwin. So all good for me. But anyway,
Okay,
go on.
good. Yeah, so in some sense, like, so much of black literature and these kind of black literary, just brilliant folk, a lot of times they didn't get characterized in that sense because the framework of the ways in which people judge the rightness or the wrongness of one's experience of faith and one's framework of faith is still bound to whiteness. So what Tony would be playing in the dark, whiteness, and the literary imagination, one could also, in some sense, rephrase that playing in the light, whiteness, and the theological imagination. So if we think about light in a sense of the Bible's use of the metaphor of light and illumination, particularly one's own spiritual illumination, in that metaphor, go out and be salt and light in the world. So if we think about, doing a close reading of that term light, and thinking about playing in the light and in some sense whiteness in the theological imagination, those people who determined what was in the light and what was illuminated by the light and what the light revealed and the revelation from the light, still was bound to the limitations of whiteness and its own theological imagination. So I encourage everybody to read this book. If people want to think critically about theology, religion, Black literature, Black life, there's a few books I'd say like you got to read. I think people should read Spirit in the Dark, a religious history of racial aesthetics by Joseph Surratt. Brilliant book.
I'll have to add it to my list.
I think people should read Farah Jasmine Griffin's new book, Read Until You Understand the Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature. I think people should read Black Womanist Ethics, where Katie Cannon does a brilliant theological reading of so many of Black women's literature, as well as people should read Emily Towns's Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil. And people should read James Cone's. He did a good job and said I wasn't going to tell nobody. He does a great job in the Spiritual and the Blues and things like that. Where what all that is to say that these Black thinkers are saying that God is not done speaking, that the canon must be expanded, and it must take seriously the sacredness, or to use the language of Professor Farah Jasmine Griffin's, the profound wisdom or the profound theology or the profound holiness in Black life and literature. And so Joseph Surratt in his book Spirit in the Dark makes the case that Black literature, that oftentimes, people thought about Black literature and their performance and embodiment and their gesturing of their faith, their embodiment of their faith, not their proclamation of their faith. We got to think about the difference between this kind of proclaimed abstract system of thought, so one can communicate what one believes about God, what one believes about faith in the Bible, rather than what Black writers were doing was embodying one's experience of God and God's experience of and the experience of God in our world. Joseph Surratt would say that Black literature was not just in resistance to Afro-Protestantism or Black Christianity, but it was the very extension of it, where so many of these writers and artists and performers grew up and were formed by the church. And the church, the Black churches, Black religious spaces beyond the church, and I'm thinking whether you're talking about synagogues or you talk about mosques or you talk about Africana religions, and the practices of our own kind of African traditional religions that theorist Charles Long, he does a great job in his book Significations, talks about. He says that Black literature is not in resistance to it, but is a very extension of it. And he says that Black literature is indeed religious literature. Now, when I came across that argument, that changed me, because it broke open the possibilities of reading Black literature. That for me, that I thought about, like, as somebody doing theological work, I wanted to ask the central question, the central and essential question: what can be gained by doing a close reading, not just a close reading, but a close theological reading of Baldwin's literature. And I'm doing Baldwin in particular now, and I'm focusing on more Tony K. Bombara. I've done work with Toni Morrison. Last semester, I even did I did a theological reading of June Jordan's poem about my rights. So I'm trying to recollect and recollect. So recollect in the sense of bringing back up, bringing back, these traditions, rebuilding the walls as we think about in the Hebrew Bible, rebuilding that which was lost and that which was stolen and that which was broken, or whatnot. Or if we think about the life of Jesus, that which was dead, I'm trying to see a sort of resurrection. So I want to take seriously what can be gleaned by doing a close theological reading of their literature. And so after reading Surratt's book and others' book, and Baldwin and Alice Walker, I started to notice like God, Christianity, faith, the Bible, religion, so much was woven into their literature.
Everywhere.
It's everywhere. It's littered everywhere. And I'm like, yo, if it's everywhere, then I need to take seriously that I can find God anywhere.
Well, and I think it's so interesting just to hear you say that, because I do think that was for me as a kid who had grown up in white privileged spaces my whole life, but who I became a Christian. And that was really unusual in my New England, Northeast, whatever thing, to take my faith really seriously. And I think that was part of what really drew me to Black literature, was that I was like, oh, these are people who are still asking serious questions. Like, it's not just faith in a box, but it's also, but they're also taking the question of who is God in our world today really seriously as well. And
I
love that.
And I think because oftentimes when people think about Black literature, and this is, I thought Dr. Surratt did a wonderful job talking about this, that people look at Black literature simply as race literature. And these ideas of race literature is just simply, how can it's almost as Imani Perry talks about in her book, Breathe, this kind of voyeurism toward Black life. It's like the how can I like look at the most messy and nasty parts of what white people do to Black people, and how can that be the totality of my intersection with the Black lived experience. Now, I want to kind of lean also on Dr. Courtney Baker in her book, Humane Insight, where she talks about, like there is, she thinks about Emmett Till and others, there is something to be gained and garnered from looking at those images, so we need a sort of, not a voyeuristic insight, but a humane insight. And if I use that language of insight, I wanted to have a theological insight as it related to Black texts. And that's when my faith came alive, because it's like, God is bound to these Black voices and bodies, and that like, I wanted to take seriously reading these Black texts as sacred texts and Black life as sacred history, that in the Bible, these books, particularly the biblical books, are an anthology. They're a collection of books. Before they're ever a book of rules, they are a book of stories. They have people names like Nehemiah and Isaiah and Daniel and Hosea. And we receive them traditionally, as divine revelation to teach us something about life and to teach us something about God and to teach us something about the world we live in and teach us something about the stories that give us meaning, because faith, that is what faith is. Faith, as the Bible says, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. At the end of the day, that sounds poetically beautiful, but at the end of the day, faith is just simply a story that gives us meaning. So for me, I wanted to receive these Black names, the book of James Baldwin, the book of Toni Morrison, the book of Alice Walker, the book of Gail Jones, the book of Tony K. Bombara and Rita Dove and Nikki Giovanni and Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X and Martin and Paul Robeson and Angela Davis. I wanted to receive these books and say, what does it mean to read these people's writings as something sacred that can teach us about how to be Black in this world and how to love God and our neighbor to the best of our being. And in some sense, I wanted to expand the canon because I believe God is still speaking. And I believe that God wants us to as well, that reading this Black literature, looking at Black life honesty and honestly and with vulnerability and with beautiful creativity and complexity, expanded my theological imagination, but it also expanded my ability to write my own narrative and weave this kind of theology bound to the Black body and the Black world, which I believe God is in and among. And so, as Alice Walker talks about in her preface of The Color Purple, and even further in The Color Purple, she says that God is the one who is beyond understanding but not beyond love. And if she talks about, I believe it pisses guys off when you walk by a field and don't notice the purple within it.
Right.
And so I think it also pisses God off when we see the beauty and the complexity and the loveliness of Black life and don't notice it and take it seriously. So that's what I wanted to do, especially in my book.
Well, that I clearly could talk to you for hours, but I know we've got a deadline here, so that you can go tend to your daughter, pick up your son. But I also think that's a beautiful place to just end this conversation with love, because that is ultimately also what I love what you just said in terms of how does this spiritual imagination and this theological imagination allow us to, in our day, in our time, love God and love our neighbors. And even just to think about, as you just said, the beauty of what it is to love God and to love neighbors. And there's in the midst of what is, a book, I want to bring it back to your book for just a sec, that involves a lot of heartbreak and the various terrorized people over the course of our just very recent history, and fear and just despair. There's also just this note of hopefulness and beauty and love that I think is animated by that desire to know what it means to love God and love neighbor, and to find the beauty of not just outside of us, the purple in the field, but also that interior beauty that we began with in this conversation. So thank you for
indeed.
All of this.
I never forget Alice Walker. I love The Color Purple. I think everybody should read The Color Purple.
Yeah.
I think The Color Purple and Temple of My Familiar is just, some of the most beautiful theological writing that I've ever come across. But at the end of The Color Purple, I think it was Nettie. It might have been Nettie, where she was like, she looked and she realized how sacred I was. And I just hope that, when people read my book, that they will realize, that they would be able to say that I looked at myself and I just realized how sacred I am. And just how beautiful we are.
Yeah,
Baldwin,
how beloved.
Baldwin, he says, when I looked in those urine stained hallways, I wondered to myself, what would happen to all that beauty? And he says, though many people don't believe it, Black people are indeed beautiful. And so hopefully people get that when they read my book.
Well, amen to all of that. And thank you for your time today.
No doubt. Thank you for having me. And to your listeners, thank y'all for listening to this episode. We hope, that y'all enjoyed it, spending a little time, broadening your insight and understanding. Hopefully you heard something you heard before. I'm not one to hope that people are always learning something new. I hope you learned something familiar. You heard something familiar. And if you did learn something new, I hope that you learn it enough that it becomes familiar in the future. And thank you for, being invested and involved.
Beautiful. And take a look at Shoutin in the Fire, an American Epistle.
Oh yeah. I forgot to talk about my book.
Yeah. I'll do that for you. I'll make sure they get that. All right. Yeah. Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. Again, check those show notes or head over to my Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook pages for details about how to win a copy of Danté's new book. And, in these show notes, there will be a list of more books than have ever before been mentioned in one episode of this podcast. I am really impressed by Danté's library. I'm also just going to remind you that I have a new book available, a little book, devotional book, but it is called Prepare Him Room. And it's available on Amazon. You can check out my website for that. And of course, I'm always grateful if you share this episode, subscribe to this podcast, give it a rating, a review. I would love for more people to benefit from these conversations. Thank you to Jake Hansen for editing this podcast, to Amber Beery for supporting this show in, every way possible. And thank you always to you, the listener. As you go into your day to day, I hope and pray that you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.